Hello class, for this mini lecture, I wanted to give you a little bit more background on what chapter 2 covers. So thus far you have probably read chapter 2 already, which talks about arguments as narratives. So what the author is trying to get us to understand is that arguments are more convincing if they are well put together stories. So when you think of it this way. So have you ever talked to a friend who tells you a story that seems so extraordinary or so out of the norm that you find it hard to believe? Well, a lot of you might be wondering, how can we know, or like, how do we know instinctively what story is well put together or real or which one isn't? That's what Holohan is talking about in chapter 2. He says that in our head, we innately, as humans, have this way of discerning which stories are true and which ones are not. So I am going to talk to you all about the narrative paradigm, which is how Holohan describes how we as humans can tell whether a story is true or not true. So let's get started with that. So the narrative paradigm refers to this model that has two parts, the narrative probability and narrative fidelity. And Holohan explains that with us going through these two parts, when we're thinking about a story, that's how we're able to tell whether a story is true or not true, or whether we find it credible or not. And when we think about arguments, we tend to side with people who have arguments that we find truthful, that we think are well put together. And also we tend to side with people who have similar experiences to what we've gone through. So the first part of the narrative paradigm um, is called the narrative probability. And one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that we as humans, we know which stories are credible, we know which ones are not. And like the author said, not all stories are created equal, not all arguments are going to be put the same way, and they're not all going to be believable. And it is up to us as humans to be able to discern which ones are believable or not. So the first part is narrative probability. Now, you all are looking at this little diagram and you're thinking, what the heck is this? Well, this diagram, if we go back to high school English, probably around the 9th or 10th grade, we went over the plot of a story. So this is what the diagram is the plot of a story. So we all know that at the very beginning of the story, we set up the characters, we kind of talk about, the scenery, we set the scene, right? That's what exposition talks about. And then we have the rising action, things start getting a little strange, some action, some conflict starts coming up. The climax is when the conflict gets to the highest, and then it gets to the resolution of it, and that's the falling action. And then the denouement is kind of like when the author ties in the story together for us. Now, thinking about this plot diagram, we find stories credible, um, the ones that stick to this plot diagram. So a story that sets like up the characters and the scenery, that has like a nice rising action, conflict starting. We have the conflict, and then the conflict, gets resolved or starts getting resolved, and then everybody, and then at the very end of the story, everything gets resolved. Most of us are unhappy if any of the stories that we hear do not match this. So I want you to think about the last time that you went to the movie theaters, pre-COVID, and you watched a movie that was part of a series of or a a sequence of movies, and then they left you at the very end with a cliffhanger. For me, that particular movie would be any of the movies like you know like, for example, 50 Shades of Grey, Twilight, any of those movies were the movies that left you with a cliffhanger at the end, and that really really upset you because you didn't get like a nice um ending. And the reason why we get upset is because we innately are looking for this plot diagram. So narrative probability explains that in order for us to be able to find the story credible, it has to follow this plot diagram. In other words, is the story coherent? Does it make sense as a whole? Is it credible? Are the characters behaving the way that they're supposed to? Are they in the scene that they're supposed to be? So again, narrative probability refers to the coherence of the story and whether or not it follows the plot diagram. So that's the first part of the narrative paradigm that Holohan talks about. Now, the second part of the narrative paradigm is called narrative fidelity. Now, most of us would agree that when it comes to the plot of the stories, most of us are quite similar. It has to have a beginning, middle, and end. That's how a story works. Most of us we're raised like that. However, narrative fidelity is the area in which the narrative paradigm differs from people to people. Because narrative fidelity talks about whether the story matches social reality. Now, the best way that I can explain this is thinking about alien contact. Now, I am a big fan of shows like Ancient Aliens or, UFOs or Encounters of a Fourth Kind. Any of those shows, I'm a big fan of that. And one of the reasons why I like these shows is because it's interesting to see how people react to these stories and how credible and how convinced people are that they actually experience this event. And that kind of falls into the idea of narrative fidelity. To these people, the idea of aliens existing, of alien abductions, alien experiments, or aliens inhabiting the earth, to them, this is something that is real, that has happened to them, so it matches their social reality. Now, one of the reasons that a lot of these people are thought about as, crazy people, they're not believed, or they are usually made fun of, or they are usually thought that, they're crazy or something like that, is because not everybody has experienced the same type of reality that they have. So, for those folks who have experienced alien contact or alien abductions, this a story about somebody else who went through the same experience does meet the idea of their narrative fidelity, as opposed to myself who I have never experienced that. Perhaps this might not meet my criteria for narrative fidelity. So remember, when we're looking at arguments, we're looking at two parts of the narrative paradigm: narrative probability, which talks about the story being coherent, and narrative fidelity, which discusses whether the story matches your idea of reality. So next time when you are thinking about arguments, think about it. Does it pass both tests, the narrative fidelity and the narrative probability, or does it only match one test? And just think about it this way, because this is how people support different candidates, support different campaigns, support different ideas, because sometimes the way that we examine a story is not the same as others. I hope that you have a clearer understanding about the topic now. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to me. And yeah, have a good day.